Title: The Last Honest Mirror. Consider Elena Vasquez, 29 years old, who makes her living capturing the world exactly as she sees it, which is to say, as it should be. Every artist believes at some private level that their vision is superior to reality. Most are content to express this opinion with paint. Elena, however, is about to discover that the painting agrees with her. And when a mirror decides to do more than reflect, when it decides to correct, the question worth asking is not what gets erased, but what was worth keeping in the first place. You are entering the haunting area. The studio smelled the way old buildings confess, dust and oil, and the particular sweetness of wood that had soaked up a century of weather without complaint. Elena had signed the lease 11 months ago because the north-facing skylights threw a light so pure and consistent it seemed curated, not sunlight so much as intention, and because the rent was low enough to mean she could paint full-time for 2 years without selling a single canvas, which was exactly the kind of reckless arithmetic she needed to believe in at 29. She'd told the landlord she loved old buildings. He'd said, "Good, because this one has opinions." She'd laughed. He hadn't. The apartment occupied the top floor of a Victorian on Delancey Street that the neighborhood had grown around and then forgotten, the way a river forgets a stone. 4 rooms, the studio, which ate 3/4 of the footprint, a kitchen the size of an afterthought, a bathroom with hexagonal tile and a clawfoot tub, and a bedroom she rarely used because she fell asleep on the studio couch most nights, too tired to walk 20 feet and too proud to admit it. The walls were horsehair plaster gone ivory with age, and they gave back sounds differently depending on the hour, footsteps in the morning, something like breathing at night. Elena worked on the self-portrait for 6 weeks before she understood what she was trying to do. The preliminary sketches she'd told herself were academic technique work, proportion studies, the kind of thing her MFA instructors had assigned, and she'd always resented. But she kept returning to her own face with an intensity that felt less like craft and more like argument. She was not, by the conventional mathematics of beauty, remarkable. A broad jaw, eyes set slightly too wide, dark and watchful, hair that couldn't decide between brown and black and had settled into something sullen between them. A scar on her chin from a bike accident at 11 that she'd always thought character building and which photographs rendered simply as damage. She knew the kind of woman people called striking when they meant not beautiful in any way I recognize, but I cannot look away. The self-portrait would be oil on linen, 36 by 48 inches, larger than life-size, and it would be honest in a way photographs were not. Photographs were liars, she'd always believed. They collapsed 3 dimensions into 2 and flattened everything that mattered: the quality of thought behind a face, the specific way a person inhabited their own skin. A painted portrait, done right, could hold the soul of someone like amber holds an insect, preserved and perfectly itself and visible from every angle. She called the painting Study in Self in her working notes and Nothing at All in Conversation because she'd told no one she was making it. Marcus found out the way he found out everything that touched Elena's private life by accident, arriving unannounced on a Tuesday evening with takeout tie and his particular talent for making himself at home in spaces that weren't his. He'd been her boyfriend for 14 months. He was warm, cheerful, and fundamentally incurious about anything he didn't find immediately pleasant to consider, which Elena had initially read as serenity and had lately come to read as a kind of selective blindness. "Who's that?" he said, setting the bags on the kitchen table and stopping in the studio doorway. The portrait sat on the main easel under the north light, which was failing at this hour, going amber gray. Elena was cleaning a brush. "Me," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way people are quiet when they're assembling a diplomatic response. "It doesn't look like you. It looks exactly like me. I mean," he gestured, a vague rolling motion. "The expression. You don't look like that." "Like what?" "I don't know." "Severe. Like you're deciding something." Elena set the brush down. The portrait's eyes, she'd spent 4 days on the eyes, looked back at her from across the room with the steady patience of someone who has already had this argument and won it. She'd painted herself without the softening she'd always unconsciously applied in photographs. No smile, no slight turning away from the camera's judgment, no arrangement of light to de-emphasize the jaw. Full front. Uncompromised. She'd painted what she looked like when she was alone and working and completely herself, and she'd gotten it right. which meant it looked like nothing she'd ever seen in any mirror. "I think it's the most accurate portrait I've ever made," she said. Marcus put his arm around her and looked at the painting over her shoulder. She could smell the Thai food on his jacket, lemongrass, something fried, and she stood very still while he looked, and she knew without examining the feeling that she wanted him to say nothing more. Whatever words he had about the portrait would be insufficient, not because he was inarticulate, but because the painting was about something he would have had to be a different kind of person to understand. "It's good," he said. "I think it's really good. You want pad see ew?" "Yes," she said, and walked into the kitchen, and tried not to look at the painting's expression as she passed, because it seemed to her for a moment, and she logged this as tiredness, working too long, needing food, that the painted face had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, into something that might have been exasperation. The building's opinions, it turned out, were delivered through sound. Not the usual settling and expanding of old wood, she'd made peace with that, learned to sleep through the specific language of the floorboards, but something more targeted. A low vibration in the plaster walls that she registered more in her back teeth than her ears. A presence in the studio at night that she noticed first as changed acoustics. The room's silence became somehow denser after 11 o'clock, the way silence gets different in an empty church. She told herself she was anthropomorphizing. It was what artists did. Projected interiority onto the inanimate. She'd been doing it since childhood, holding conversations with objects, sensing moods in weather. Her therapist, who she still phoned every other Thursday, called it high sensitivity. Elena called it seeing clearly. She was 3 weeks into the portrait's completion, the face finished, the background a deep Prussian blue she'd been building in glazes, when she noticed the first change. It was in the painting itself, or not in the painting exactly, but in what the painting contained. She'd been painting her hair pulled back, 2 loose strands falling forward at the temples. This she was certain of. She had photographs of her reference set up. She had the preliminary drawings pinned to the left wall. She had the memory of mixing that particular sullen, not brown, not black, with a touch of burnt sienna to get the warmth right. But on a Thursday morning she came into the studio with her coffee and stood before the canvas, and the hair was different, still pulled back. Still the right color, but the 2 loose strands had been, she could only think of it as, resolved, tittied. They fell now with a precision that felt intentional rather than accidental, framing the face rather than escaping it. She thought she'd done it herself. She was prone to working in a half-awake state some evenings, glass of wine, music low, a painterly autopilot that produced her best and most surprising work. She checked the brushes. They were as she'd left them, clean in their jar. Checked the palette, dry, nothing mixed fresh. She stood in the north light for a long time with her coffee going cold, and she decided she had done it herself and simply forgotten, and she did not examine this explanation too carefully because the alternative was less comfortable. The change she noticed in the world, as opposed to the canvas, came 10 days later. Her friend Priya had been supposed to join her for the gallery walk in the meatpacking district on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of meandering cultural occasion that justified itself mostly through conversation. Priya was her oldest friend, from undergrad, sharp, difficult, the only person Elena knew who criticized her work without softening the criticism into suggestion. Elena valued this with the fierce specificity of someone who understood how rare actual honesty was. Priya didn't show. Elena called and got voicemail. Texted and got nothing. Went home eventually and texted again and heard nothing until Sunday evening, when Priya sent 3 words. Sorry, wasn't feeling it. No follow-up, no explanation. Elena thought, that's odd, and then thought, everyone has those days, and filed it. But the next time she suggested plans, Priya was vague, and the time after that, and by the 4th iteration 3 weeks after the gallery walk, Elena realized she hadn't actually spoken to Priya in a month, and that the silence felt different from busy, different from distracted. It felt like a kind of erasure, like something that had been vivid was going gray at the edges. She called. Priya picked up. Are we okay? Elena asked. A pause. Of course. Why? I've just been busy. The voice was warm, familiar, entirely correct, and also somehow at a distance that had nothing to do with the phone. How's the painting? Good, nearly done. Elena looked at the portrait across the studio. How are you? How's the thing with Daniel? Another pause. Daniel? Your boyfriend? The one you've been seeing since February? I don't, Priya laughed, a short, uncertain sound. I don't know anyone named Daniel. Elena sat very still. Priya, you've been dating Daniel for 9 months. You brought him to my birthday. He's a structural engineer. He has a thing about Elena. Priya's voice was gentle and patient and wholly wrong. I think you're thinking of someone else. I'm not dating anyone. Elena looked at the portrait. The portrait, as always, looked back level, patient, absolutely certain of itself. She went to her phone's photos and searched February and found her birthday dinner at the Vietnamese place on Orchard Street. 5 people around the table. Marcus, Priya, a woman named Jo from her old painting class, Elena herself, caught mid-laugh at an angle that she hated, and 4 people, she counted again, Priya, Jo, Marcus, Elena. She found the group text from the birthday planning. Priya, Jo, Marcus, me. Who's getting the cake? She found Marcus's response about the cake. She found Jo's response. She found Priya's response. She did not find Daniel's response because Daniel did not appear in the group text at all, except she remembered him there. She could hold the memory clearly, could feel his handshake, could remember the specific, characteristic nerd joy with which he'd described load-bearing calculations, and the text thread said otherwise. She put the phone down on the studio floor and looked at the portrait for a long time. The background had changed again. The Prussian blue was the same, her hand on that, her glaze work, but the quality of the dark had shifted. It was deeper now, more intentional, less like night and more like the moment before. And the face, she crossed the studio in 4 steps and stood directly before the canvas, 2 feet away, close enough to see the brushwork. The long strokes in the background, the short, patient marks in the skin tones, the glaze over glaze of the darks in the eyes. All her work, all her technique, her particular hand that she'd recognize anywhere. The face was the same, and not the same. The jaw was identical, the nose, the scar. But the expression had refined itself past what she remembered painting, past severe and deciding into something she could only describe as certain. The painted eyes looked at her with the complete equanimity of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and has no interest in explaining it. Her own face, become a stranger. She took the portrait off the easel and put it in the bedroom closet. She slept for the first time in months in the bed. In the morning, the portrait was back on the easel. She hadn't done it. She knew she hadn't done it because she'd been unable to sleep at all. The studio's altered silence pressing through the thin bedroom wall, her own insomnia, a physical sensation, lying rigid and listening. And she'd had ears for every creak of the floorboards, the particular voice of each one, and no person had moved through the apartment in the night. She stood in the studio doorway in the gray morning light and looked at the painting on the easel, and the painting looked back. And she understood then that the problem was not supernatural, which would have been manageable, but was instead something stranger. The problem was that the portrait was right. It had come back to the light because it belonged there. This was its room. She had made something that knew its own place in the world, and closets were not it. She sat on the studio couch with her knees pulled up and her coffee, and she looked at it. Really looked, the way she looked at other people's work, the way she tried to look at her own when she was brave enough. It was the finest portrait she'd ever made. The light in it was extraordinary. That specific quality of the north-facing studio rendered in paint so precisely she could feel the temperature of it looking at the canvas. The technique was everything she'd been trying to build for 12 years. It was unambiguously herself. And it was also something more deliberate than herself, something that had a preference. She called Marcus that night and said she needed to talk, and Marcus arrived with his habitual Thai takeout and his habitual warmth, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "Do you remember Daniel, Priya's boyfriend?" Marcus was good at being present. He arranged his face into listening. Priya's boyfriend Daniel, you met him at my birthday." Marcus thought about this with visible sincerity. "I don't think Priya brought anyone to your birthday." "She did. She's been with him since February." Marcus shook his head slowly, not the headshake of someone who knows and disagrees, the headshake of someone checking a room they know to be empty. "I really don't." "Don't do that," Elena said, and heard something new in her own voice, urgency edged with panic, and under the panic something that frightened her more. Certainty. He existed. He was at that table. You talked to him about the Williamsburg Bridge. Elena. Marcus reached across the table and she let him take her hand. Maybe you're thinking of a different dinner. You had a lot of people at. He's been erased, she said. The kitchen went quiet. Outside, the street, a truck, somebody's music, the normal machinery of a city carrying on. Erased, Marcus said carefully. By the painting. She watched his face. I know how that sounds. He was quiet for a long moment, and she had enough of his face memorized to see him decide something. Have you been sleeping? Don't. I'm asking because I care about. I'm asking if you remember a man named Daniel who was at my birthday dinner in February and you're managing me instead of answering. Because the answer worries me, he said. I don't remember Daniel because I don't think Daniel exists. And the reason I think that is, he paused, chose carefully. You've been working really hard. The portrait, I know it means a lot to you, and you've been kinds of what? Alone? He said, spending a lot of time alone in there with it. She pulled her hand back. She looked at him, at his good, warm, structurally uncomplicated face, and she felt the thought arrive before she could stop it, that he was exactly the kind of person the portrait would prefer, uncritical, comfortable. Not going to ask difficult questions about what she was trying to do, not going to challenge the vision. The portrait had refined the world toward its own aesthetic, and its aesthetic included Marcus precisely because Marcus would not argue with it. She stood up from the table. I need you to go home tonight, she said. He left, baffled and wounded in equal measure, and she walked into the studio and sat on the floor in front of the portrait and said aloud to the empty room, What else have you changed? The north-facing skylights had gone fully dark. The studio's nighttime density had gathered around her, that particular thickened silence. The portrait's face was 3 feet away, visible in the single standing lamp she'd left on, the jaw, the 2 wide eyes, the chin scar, the expression that had traveled past severe, past certain, and arrived somewhere she might, on another night, have called patient. The mouth had not moved. She'd have staked anything on that. But she sat there in the lamplight and let the thought she'd been refusing arrive in full. The painting doesn't think it's changing reality. The painting thinks it's correcting it. She called Priya the next morning, and before Priya could speak, she said, Tell me what's wrong with the self-portrait. A pause. I haven't seen it. I know, but I'm telling you it exists. I'm asking you hypothetically, from everything you know about me, about my work, what would be wrong with it? Another pause, longer, and Elena heard Priya deciding whether to engage or deflect, and she heard Priya choose, honestly, please. You'd make it too perfect. You'd get the technique exactly right, and you'd get the likeness exactly right, and you'd miss the point, which is that you've been trying to edit yourself into something acceptable for your entire career, and the best work you've ever done is the stuff where you forgot to. The portraits of other people, the street work, when you stop trying to get it right, you get it right. Elena was quiet. Is that what you wanted to hear? Priya asked. No, Elena said. It's what I needed to hear. She looked at the portrait. The portrait's expression hadn't changed. Why would it? It was certain of itself. It had always been certain of itself. It had looked at the world with those 2 wide painted eyes and determined what fit and what didn't, and quietly, methodically, with the precision of a master editor, removed the things that complicated its vision. Daniel, because Daniel was noise, the loose strands of hair because they were imprecision. What next? She thought Priya eventually, because Priya said hard things that the portrait wouldn't like. And after Priya, the portrait wouldn't be wrong anymore. Nothing near it would be wrong anymore. The world would have been corrected to match the vision, and the vision would be flawless, and Elena would be alone in a Victorian apartment with a painting of herself that was more herself than she was, looking at nothing that challenged it, surrounded by everyone who agreed. The thought arrived quietly, without drama. This is what I've always wanted. This is exactly what I've always wanted. A world arranged to match the vision. She sat with that for a long time. She didn't destroy the portrait. She'd thought she would, had even stood before it with a palette knife, feeling the weight of the thing in her hand, the specific moral clarity of the act she was about to perform, but she couldn't do it. It was too good. That was the precise and terrible truth. It was the finest work of her life, and she couldn't unmake it any more than she could unlearn to paint. What she did instead was less dramatic and stranger, and, she thought, more honest. She got out a fresh canvas, 40 by 40, and she painted the portrait. Not a copy of herself, a portrait of the portrait. She set it on the secondary easel and painted what she saw. The impossible certainty of the expression, the technique that was hers and not hers, the quality of the dark blue behind the face which had been Prussian and was now something that didn't have a name on any color chart she knew. She painted the portrait as what it was, a thing that had exceeded her intention and was now entirely itself, with its own preferences and its own corrections and its own vision of how the world should be arranged. She painted it honestly, and while she painted, she called Priya back and said, "Come over and tell me what's wrong with this one too." And she texted Marcus, "I owe you a real conversation. Not tonight, soon." And she got the preliminary drawings of herself down from the left wall, the ones with the loose strands of hair. The ones before the portrait had tidied its own vision, and she pinned them where she could see them. The portrait watched her do all of this. She was aware of it watching, aware of the weighted silence of a thing that had developed opinions, and she worked anyway, brush moving, and did not ask its permission, and did not tidy the strands of hair in the new painting, and did not try to make the expression certain. She painted herself painting it. She made herself look uncertain. It was the truest thing she'd ever put on canvas. 3 days later, she went looking for Daniel. Not because she was sure she'd find him, she wasn't and didn't, but because the act of looking felt important. She retraced what she remembered, the structural engineering firm in Long Island City where Priya had said he worked, a name she'd heard but couldn't quite resolve into certainty, the neighborhood he'd mentioned, the specific way he'd described the Williamsburg Bridge's load distribution as emotionally satisfying, the kind of precise, happy nerd detail that stuck. She found a structural engineer named D. Farquhar who'd been at the firm until, according to LinkedIn, he'd left 6 months ago. No further trail, no social media. A professional absence so clean it had the quality of an edit. She stood on the Long Island City street in the particular gray of a November afternoon and looked at the firm's glass door and understood she would not find Daniel. The portrait had been thorough. Whatever Daniel had been was now the shape of where he'd been, a LinkedIn ghost, a Priya who remembered nothing, a birthday photo with 4 people where there had been 5. She walked back to the subway. She thought about what it meant to be the only person who remembered someone. She thought about all the ways people got erased, not by paintings, but by time, by departure, by the slow collective forgetting of everyone who'd known them. She thought about how the portrait had only done efficiently what the world did anyway. She thought, the portrait is not the problem. I am the problem. The portrait is what I made. The portrait is what I wanted, made autonomous, made effective. The painting can't want anything I didn't teach it to want. She sat with that on the N train, watching the tunnel windows show her own reflection between stations. When she got back to the studio, the portrait of the portrait was gone. The canvas was there. She could see the empty easel. She looked everywhere, under the couch, in the closet she'd tried once before, in the kitchen, in the bathroom. Nothing. The second canvas had been removed as neatly as Daniel, as neatly as the loose strands of hair. And she understood. The portrait didn't care about being painted, but it cared about being painted as it was. It cared about the specificity of her honesty. It cared about the uncertain expression. She stood in the studio and breathed. Then she got out a new canvas. She painted it again. She would keep painting it. This was what she understood now, standing at the easel in the north light with the portrait 3 feet to her right and the building doing its nightly density gathering around her. She would paint it honestly every time it erased the honest version, and it would erase the honest version, and she would paint it again. It might go on indefinitely. It probably would. She had the rest of her life, and the portrait had, presumably, longer. But here was what she knew, brush in hand, mixing a dark that was neither Prussian nor anything with a name. She had made the thing that was trying to erase her. She had made it from her own desire, the deep, secret, years-long desire to be sufficient, to have her vision accepted as final, to stop being revised by everyone who looked at her and found her not quite right. The portrait was her wanting, made autonomous. It was the part of her that had always believed the world would be better arranged to match her vision, and it had simply, unlike her, acted on this belief without apology. She could hate it for that. Or she could paint. She chose to paint. She painted herself, uncertain jaw, too broad hair, with its sullen color and its loose escaping strands, eyes too wide and dark and watching, scar on the chin like a small biography, expression in the precise middle distance between knowing and not knowing, which was, she understood now, the only honest place any of them ever stood. The portrait watched from the other easel. She didn't look at it. She painted. Elena Vasquez will finish this canvas. The portrait will erase it. She will begin again. This cycle will continue for years, and in those years she will become the finest painter of her generation, not in spite of the portrait, but because of it. The portrait wanted a world without argument. What it made, instead, was an artist who could no longer afford to stop. Daniel will not return. Some of what is lost stays lost. But the portrait will not erase Priya, because Elena will not let Priya be erased. And it turns out that the things we fight for are the very things our perfect visions were trying to delete. We all carry a self-portrait in us, silently correcting, trimming the strands of hair, editing the people who see us too clearly. The difference between the portrait and the rest of us is simply this: we choose, most mornings, to pick up the brush anyway. And that choice, made daily with full knowledge of the alternative, that is what it means to be alive, here in the particular middle distance between the world as it is and the world as we insist on painting it. You have just visited the haunting area.